Doc, be honest with me. Can masturbating every day damage the prostate? At 66, Robert sat across from me in the exam room, eyes downcast, voice quiet. He had come in for his annual checkup, but something else was clearly weighing on him. After a moment of awkward silence, he leaned in slightly and whispered, almost embarrassed to ask. It wasn't a question rooted in humor or immaturity. It was asked by a man who had been living with guilt, possibly for decades. Robert had retired 3 years ago from a long career as a mechanical engineer. Widowed early, no kids. Lived alone in a modest house outside Kansas City. He'd kept to a quiet routine. Morning walks, crossword puzzles, occasional church potlucks. But in the privacy of his home, masturbation had remained one of the few steady sources of physical release and comfort until a few months ago his symptoms started: frequent urination, a feeling of incomplete emptying, a weaker stream. Nothing urgent, but enough to make him worry, and the fear began to whisper, maybe I brought this on myself. Hi, I'm glad you're here. If you or someone you care about is a man over 60, I hope you'll stay with me, because this is a story many men live, but few dare to speak aloud. Today, we're going to walk through Robert's journey, one that begins with shame and confusion, but ends in something quite different: science, understanding, and a deeper sense of peace. Before we go further, I invite you to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, or leave a comment if anything resonates with you. You never know who might need to hear what you have to say. And if you stay through the end, I'll share one of the most surprising findings ever published on male sexual health and the prostate, a study from Harvard that changed how I talk to every man about this topic. But first, let's go back to Robert. I don't know if it's because I did it too often, he said, but I've been doing it pretty much daily for most of my adult life. Is that bad? I told him something that made his shoulders drop immediately. No, Robert, it's not bad. In fact, what you've been doing might have been quietly protecting your health all along. That surprised him, then confused him. So I explained. The prostate is a small gland, but it plays a big role in male sexual and urinary function. It produces much of the fluid that carries sperm during ejaculation. And like any organ that stores fluid, regular release keeps it healthy. Holding everything in, especially over time, can lead to stagnation, inflammation, and in some cases, abnormal cellular changes. That's when I shared something that truly shifted his understanding. A long-term Harvard study tracked more than 30,000 men over nearly 2 decades. It found that men who ejaculated at least 21 times per month had a 33% lower risk of developing prostate cancer compared to men who ejaculated less frequently. And that wasn't a fluke. It was one of the most rigorous studies ever conducted on the topic, and it directly countered the myth that masturbation causes prostate harm. Instead, the evidence showed ejaculation helps clear the prostate of potentially harmful substances. It reduces the buildup of inflammatory proteins, and it may help flush out microtoxins that otherwise linger in the gland. I had no idea, Robert said. I thought I was doing something wrong. You're not, I told him. You're human, and your body was simply using a natural mechanism to maintain balance. This didn't mean that daily masturbation was required, or that more was always better. But it did mean that what he'd been doing wasn't damaging. In fact, it may have been quietly helpful. He sat back in his chair, a little taller than before. "I guess I've been carrying a lot of shame over nothing," he said, "and nobody ever told me otherwise." "You're not alone," I said. "Most men your age never get clear answers about this part of their health, and the silence creates fear where there should be understanding." We still had more to talk about: his urination symptoms, lifestyle habits, and a few changes we'd eventually make together. But that conversation was a turning point. Because Robert didn't just learn something that day, he unlearned something too. He let go of years of silent guilt, and in its place, we began to build something better: knowledge, confidence, and permission to trust his body again. In the next part of Robert's story, we'll dive deeper into what causes those annoying urinary symptoms and why they don't always mean something is seriously wrong. Because when men understand their bodies, they stop fearing them. And when fear leaves the room, healing can begin. When Robert came back for his follow-up visit, he looked lighter. Not because all his symptoms had disappeared, they hadn't. But because something else had changed, he no longer felt ashamed. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me, "about how what I thought was harmful might actually have been helpful." He paused, "But I'm still waking up at night to pee, still getting that feeling like I didn't go all the way. What if it's something worse? That fear of cancer lives quietly inside many older men. Every shift in the body, every new sensation becomes a possible threat." So I told Robert the truth. And the truth was this: what you're describing sounds like benign prostatic hyperplasia. Not cancer, not dangerous, just common. He blinked. "Benign? Prostatic? What?" I smiled. "BPH, an enlarged prostate. Happens to most men after 50. It's not your fault. It's not a disease. It's your body adapting to time." That seemed to land somewhere between relief and confusion. So I explained more. The prostate, shaped like a walnut in youth, slowly grows with age. Partly due to changes in testosterone, partly due to a hormone called DHT, a more potent form of testosterone that builds up over time and stimulates growth in prostate tissue. By age 60, nearly half of all men experience some symptoms of BPH. By 70, it's closer to 70%. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It just means the urethra, the tube that passes urine, has less room to work with. "It's like stepping on a garden hose," I told him. "The water still comes out, but the flow is weaker, and sometimes the hose doesn't empty completely." That image made him laugh. "So I'm a garden hose now?" "In the best possible way," I said. He sat back, absorbing this new view of his body, not as broken, but as aging in a predictable, understandable way. "So what do I do?" he asked. "First," I said, "we stop panicking. Then, we support your body naturally." We talked about simple, proven steps: regular walking, 20 to 30 minutes a day, to improve pelvic blood flow, a diet rich in vegetables, especially tomatoes, pumpkin seeds, and cruciferous greens like broccoli and kale, reducing caffeine and alcohol in the evening, practicing deep breathing to lower stress, since chronic tension aggravates urinary symptoms, sleeping with a pillow between the knees to relieve pelvic pressure at night. None of this was extreme. None of it was medication. It was about reminding the body how to work with itself, not against itself. Robert took notes. He had the quiet diligence of an engineer, someone who didn't need dramatic fixes, just clear instructions and a sense of control. As we wrapped up, he looked thoughtful. "I spent so long being afraid," he said, "afraid that I'd ruined something, that I'd waited too long. But now, it doesn't feel like fear anymore. Just information." "That's the point," I told him. "You're not fighting a disease. You're listening to a body that's evolving, that's aging, that's doing its best." He nodded. "You know, what's strange," he added, "I feel like I'm getting to know my body for the first time. That might be the most important moment of all, because most men don't get taught how to understand themselves. They're told to perform, to endure, to be strong. But they're not told how to listen." Robert was learning to listen. In the next part of his story, we'll talk about the emotional impact of prostate concerns, the anxiety, the intimacy issues, the silence between partners, and how understanding the body can heal not just the symptoms, but the soul. Because knowledge doesn't just treat problems, it restores dignity. Robert didn't speak much the first few minutes of our third visit. He sat with his hands folded, eyes on the floor. The usual energy he brought, cautious but curious, felt muted. Like something heavier had settled in. "I've been thinking a lot," he finally said. "Not about the urination stuff, that I can handle." He looked up. "It's the other stuff." I knew what he meant before he said it. He was talking about what most men over 60 never say out loud. The changes in desire, the softer erections, the longer recovery time, the silence between the sheets. "I used to think about sex," he said, "not obsessively, just normally, but now I feel like it's vanished. And I don't know if it's me or my body or my age, and part of me wonders if I'm still a man." There it was. The question so many men carry deep inside. If my body isn't working like it used to, am I still worthy? I didn't rush to answer. I let the air sit for a moment. Then I said, "Robert, what you're feeling is more common than you can imagine. And it's not about failure. It's about biology. As men age, testosterone levels naturally decline. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. And with that decline often comes decreased libido, softer or less frequent erections, slower recovery after intimacy, and sometimes a quiet sense of loss. Not loss of function, but of identity. Because we don't just tie masculinity to strength or status. We tie it to performance, to drive, to potency. When those shift, even slightly, the soul starts to ask questions. "I haven't been with anyone since my wife passed," Robert said. "But sometimes I think, if I met someone, what would I even have to offer?" I asked him something in return. "What did you offer her when you were 30? Was it just sex?" He smiled faintly. "No, it was laughter, late-night talks, holding hands in the car. She used to fall asleep on my chest while we watched the news." I nodded. "And all of that came from your body, not just your penis, your voice, your warmth, your arms, your presence." He was quiet. Then he said, "So maybe I didn't lose everything." "You didn't lose yourself," I said. "You just stopped recognizing parts of you that were always there." We talked about ways to support healthy testosterone levels, getting consistent sleep, managing stress and blood sugar, strength training a few times a week, eating healthy fats and zinc-rich foods, avoiding excessive alcohol and environmental toxins. None of this was extreme. None of it was a magic bullet. But together, these steps help the body remember its own chemistry. Still, I reminded him, reclaiming manhood isn't about hormone levels. It's about coming home to the self, to the parts we forget are masculine. Gentleness, integrity, presence, humor, patience, wisdom. Robert nodded, slowly. I spent so long trying not to talk about this, he said. I figured silence made me strong. But silence, I told him, only makes us disappear from ourselves. He looked up. You ever feel like you've been gone and didn't realize it? All the time, I said. But the fact that you're asking that question means you're already on your way back. That day, Robert didn't walk out of my office with a prescription. He walked out with something deeper, a renewed sense of self, a quiet belief that he wasn't broken, just adjusting, that his body wasn't betraying him. It was inviting him to listen more closely. In the next part of his story, we'll talk about how Robert began rebuilding his rhythm, sleeping better, moving more, eating differently, and how those small, natural shifts became the foundation for something he thought he'd lost forever. Desire. Not just sexual desire, but the desire to live fully. Because when men reconnect with their bodies, they reconnect with life. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't overnight. But slowly, over the next few weeks, something in Robert began to shift. It started with sleep. Just a little more at first, an extra hour here, a smoother night there. Then his energy returned in flickers, a desire to walk farther, to make breakfast, to open the blinds and let the sun in without grumbling. I forgot what it felt like to want to do something, he told me. His routine became his medicine. A short walk every morning. Lunch with real greens, not just sandwiches. Phone off after dinner. One old vinyl record each night, just for the pleasure of hearing something warm and familiar. The man who once asked if he was still a man now stood straighter. His voice had changed, still soft, but no longer apologetic. This might sound silly, he said during one visit, but I picked up my guitar again. He hadn't touched it in years. I didn't even try to tune it. I just held it, like I was remembering something I used to know. That's what healing looks like, not dramatic reversals, but the return of small things. One night, he called an old friend he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. They laughed about nonsense for 40 minutes. The next day, he brought me a pecan pie his neighbor had baked. He'd asked her to make an extra. I used to think I didn't matter, he said, but now I show up in my own life, and that, I believe, is what health is for. Not perfection, not youth, but presence. He wasn't perfect. Some nights, he still woke up. Some mornings, the energy came slow, but he no longer saw these as signs of failure. They were just part of the rhythm. I used to think something was wrong with me, he said, but maybe I just stopped caring. And now, I care again. In caring, he moved. In moving, he rested. In resting, he remembered who he was. None of this came from a prescription. It came from permission. Permission to stop hiding, to stop judging, to stop assuming that silence was strength. Maybe what Robert had needed all along wasn't to fix his body. Maybe what he needed was to forgive it. In the final part of his story, we'll talk about the quiet dignity that comes not from solving everything, but from learning to stay with yourself. Because sometimes healing isn't about doing more. It's about noticing what matters again. In our final visit, Robert walked in differently. He wasn't faster or stronger or visibly transformed. But something about him had changed. Something in the way he took his seat without apology. In the way he looked me in the eye. In the way he didn't begin with a complaint. "I feel," he said, "like I'm not fighting myself anymore." Not every symptom had disappeared. Some nights, he still woke up once to pee. Some mornings, he still felt the fog of age linger a little too long. But none of it felt like punishment now. It just felt normal. "I used to believe health meant fixing things," he said. "Now I think it might mean listening." We sat quietly for a moment, and then he added, "Maybe this version of me, right now, isn't worse than the old me. Just different, slower, but softer, kinder." That word stuck with me. Kinder. Because in all my years of working with men over 60, I've seen the same story repeat again and again. Men taught to endure, to push through, to keep silent, but rarely taught to be kind to themselves. Robert had learned what many never do, that masculinity isn't about power, it's about presence. That strength isn't in resistance, it's in awareness. That healing doesn't always come from doing more, but from surrendering, gently, to what the body is already asking for. He told me he had started writing again. Nothing fancy. Just a few lines each morning before coffee. Not about anything important, he said. Just how I'm feeling. Where my mind went last night, sometimes just one word. Like breathe, or enough, or grateful. I asked if he ever went back to read them. He shook his head. "Not yet. I'm not writing to remember. I'm writing to remind myself that I'm still here. That, I believe, is the quiet revolution of growing older. Not trying to become who you once were, but learning to honor who you are now." Robert's body hadn't failed him. It had simply asked him to listen more closely, to let go of shame, to step back into his own skin, not with regret, but with reverence. He hadn't needed to perform. He had needed to pause. He hadn't needed to impress. He had needed to feel. And in that space, where performance stopped and permission began, he rediscovered something even more valuable than youth: self-trust. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Because I saw it. In his relaxed shoulders, in the warmth in his voice. In the way he said goodbye, not like a patient, but like a man who finally felt like himself again. So if you've been watching this and wondering whether your own body is betraying you, I hope Robert's story reminds you, your body might not be broken, it might just be trying to speak. And maybe, just maybe, you don't need fixing. Maybe you need rest, gentleness, consistency, a few quiet greens on your plate, a slower morning, a softer expectation, and above all, the grace to say, I am still here and I'm worth listening to. If this story has touched something in you, leave a comment below. You're not alone. You're not too late. You're not beyond help. You're simply human. And humans heal best when they're seen, especially by themselves. Thank you for walking through Robert's journey. I hope in some way it helps you come home to your own